I'm going to start with Seth because your book really takes us all the way back to the beginning. And so walk us through, as you make some initial comments, walk us through how this polarization that brought us all here tonight, that we're all seeing, really started with the foundation of our country.
Well, as I over the last 5 years, as I've gotten more and more into this project, I became a firm believer that we can only understand where we are today by investigating and tracing back our polarization to our roots. And so I undertook a research project which led to this book, which was just about doing that type of investigative tracing. And let me borrow, sometimes I keep saying next, do you have the clicker? This way I don't, because I'm going to just fly through these, and this way.
Super finicky, so
it's finicky. That's a problem. Do I just click? No, let's see. Okay. Oh, by the way, so American Schism is an interesting story. I'm going to explain in a second why a business executive who most recently was CEO of a company called Proactive and sold acne medication, why did I take on to help heal our nation? The book recently won the International Book Award for Best General Nonfiction for 2022, and it is a finalist in all new nonfiction categories. So I'm a little bit proud on that, which is why. Let's see. Okay, so the three things I want to talk about. Like I said, why did I undertake this? Then I'm going to give you three takeaways that I think are important, but I hope that doesn't stop you from buying the book. And then, go right to like how we move forward. So go to the prescriptive part. The book really has three different parts. The first is this tracing of our history using a model. The second is using that model to analyze 5 discrete episodes in American history. And then the last part is about pulling it all together and deciding how we can have a plan to move forward. Okay, so let's see. It is finicky. Okay, you're right. Okay. So a lot of people have asked me, what was the cocktail party moment? Why did I leave what was a very lucrative career? You don't leave a lucrative business career to write a nonfiction book. For those of you to make money, that's not the reason you do it. So unless you're somebody who's very well known. But certainly that wasn't the case with me. So people ask me, well, why did I do this? What in addition to noticing that our public discourse had collapsed in recent years and watching how rancor and acrimony kind of what I could say crowded out logical debate amongst people in the public arena, what most concerned me is that my peers in business, I've run many consumer products companies, and private sector leaders, my CEOs, C-level executives, were increasingly afraid to touch political issues. It had become like a third rail for fear that they would be canceled, that there was no upside. And so what alarmed me and what I said to myself, if both public sector leaders are not solving problems and private sector leaders won't engage, we're in trouble. This portends a doom of our democracy. And so I started to do research in this area at that point. And here's what, it is okay. So the investigative journey was done using a lot of information that I've read over the years. There was one particular professor of the Enlightenment that was very influential and became an advisor for me. And I since I don't have a PhD in these fields, I got some help. But ultimately, the first takeaway what I want to say is that we are at a tremendously difficult tipping point. This is before reading the New York Times front story article today. We're at a tipping point where our modern society is at tremendous peril, in my view, and we risk reverting to what I call a pre-Enlightenment dark ages, where illiberal thought and autocratic rule become the norm, and therefore, we have to understand why that's happened. And this is why the tracing is so important. But let me just spend a minute, I'm not going to spend a lot of time tonight talking about the Enlightenment and what I call 2 different Enlightenments, because the Enlightenment is such a bad term today. Most people associate the Enlightenment with like these white European guys. And what does it have to do with us today? And whereas, I argue in the book that the Enlightenment is the fundamental framework that's created more prosperity in the last 200 years than in the prior 2000. And if you look at any objective data like life expectancy, which was 40 years, 200 years ago, and is now over 70 worldwide, or the fact that 200 years ago, 4/5 of the world lived in tremendous poverty. And today, about 1/5 of the world lives in that level of poverty. And all of this, in my mind, is due to this thing called the Enlightenment that created a modern liberal society. And that's what's at danger. That's why we're having so much trouble in not just America, but across all these democracies. Wow, I see. You have to clear, and I think I got it. So the first takeaway is that it really is due to this Enlightenment modern societal framework that's fundamental that we're abandoning right now. Second one is that the history can act as a salve for our wounds if only we'd apply it. So we need to be able to use history, because what history shows is that the American schism started back at our founding, and we've always had huge polarization in our society. And at sometimes we've dealt with it well, and sometimes very poorly. And that's the distinction. Why we had a secret formula for dealing with our differences, and we're not deploying that secret formula anymore. So here's where I could spend, since I don't have much time, I'm not going to go into too much detail about these two different enlightenments. But the argument is that the schism, the polarization, started by two very fundamentally different views of what the social contract should look like. So if for those of you who remember the Enlightenment, which was about a lot of things, in the political arena, the framework was called the social contract. Why should we get together? And to Paul's question before, why should we form a society? What are we doing here? What's the point of all this? And what you found is that there were two very different schools of thought. There were the moderates, people like John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, and in Europe, people like Rousseau and Locke, et cetera. And then there were the radicals. And the radicals and moderates differed in many areas, but I'm going to focus on two, because these two differences caused the first American schism. And in simple terms, it was this. The radicals believed that the only legitimate form of a social contract that could be sustainable was a representative democracy, that democracy mattered. The moderates eschewed democracy. They believed in what could be called an aristocratic republic, where people like themselves, who were enlightened, ruled. It was their obligation. And a lot of this came from the French radical enlightenment, particularly. But in the US, we had three proponents of this radical side, which were Jefferson, Franklin, and Paine. And so one was about what form of government should be in the first place. The second key difference had to do with the role of the church and the state. And it was the radicals, the French radicals in particular, had documented for centuries how the church and the monarchy had colluded to oppress the people. So they came up with the notion of separation of church and state. But the point is, for the point today, what I want to say is there was this huge split, and it's best illustrated in the move from the spirit of 76, when the radical enlightenment ruled, to the time of when the Constitution was written 11 years later, where the moderates ended up taking control. And part of this was to do for very practical purposes. 1776 was an idealistic moment. We were breaking away. The Declaration is probably one of the most important radical Enlightenment documents ever written. But by the time the war's over, 7 years later, we've got a lot of problems, like who's going to pay for the war? How are we going to have a foreign policy, which we desperately need? So how are we going to create commerce between these 13 very different? So the people who had the solutions to these problems tended to be the moderates, the geniuses like Alexander Hamilton. And so that's why the Constitution, in essence, became this compromise, or set of compromises between these two very different views of what America should be. And it wasn't all pretty. The Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, which became the two sides, had tremendous rancor and acrimony between them. It was a very difficult time. But there was this model of compromise that's so important. So what the book does is it then describes this moderate radical pendulum and looks at these different epochs of our history when they played out. And so it goes through the Jeffersonian presidency, Reconstruction, the populist movement, the civil rights era, and the recent era. And what's important about this framework is that there are three forces that are really battling throughout our history. And that's what the analysis shows. You had these two visions of governance, this radical moderate push and pull, but you also had a very strong, starting with the Second Great Awakening, a counter-Enlightenment push. that became very important, that's affected every epoch of our history, which are forces that reject the Enlightenment as being the primary foundation of civic life. So those three forces interacted in very interesting ways, which I won't have time to go into, but suffice it to say that there was this formula that I call the secret sauce for how we resolve the differences over our history. And it had to do with making sure that facts mattered, that reason and compromise were at the center of whatever we were doing. Whereas often we had social unrest that didn't use that formula, which led to horrific violence. And whether it's one of the examples I use all the time about this is immigration, because I think it's a perfect example of how we're teetering between these two approaches. In 2013, there was a comprehensive bill called the Immigration Reform Bill that addressed a myriad set of issues related to immigration. And of course, it was quite complex, as immigration is. And no one was happy. Someone on the left really were concerned that there were things like quotas. They weren't called quotas, but there were limits to immigration. People on the right were concerned about that there was a pathway to citizenship for dreamers. So neither side was happy, which, by the way, the book explains is a key, that's a checkpoint, that like we're in good shape if neither side is happy. But in fact, so we that passed the Senate and would have passed the House had it been brought to the floor, but just missed. And so as a consequence, here we are 9 years later, and we're screaming about building walls and opening borders. And so it's like a perfect demonstration of we had this secret sauce formula that we almost enacted, and we rejected that, and we prefer to scream at each other. And you can almost any public policy problem we face today, there are these two directions we can choose to go in. It's not as simple as all that, but the book describes why that's so. Now, just to give you guys a sense, and I only have 2 or 3 more slides, but the core issues underlying the American schism through all these episodes are 3 things. One is, what form of government do we believe in? Should it be a bottom-up form of government of the people, or is somehow the government top-down? Is it autocratic or given by God top-down? There's a famous painting I love talking about in the early 1800s. The painting depicts God handing General Washington the tablets, which were the Constitution, like as if it were the 10 Commandments being handed to Moses. And of course, that's ironic for so many reasons. First of all, it's ironic because the Declaration says that we the people decide to form a government. It's not handed down, much less in stone. The Constitution was supposed to be changed every generation. But that image was the result of the revisionism of the Second Great Awakening, which created our founding as something as a divine event, which of course it wasn't at all. Anyway, so this notion of form of government is fundamental. And when I speak to organizations today who are on different sides of the political divide, as opposed to discussing issues of the day, I go back to these basic questions, like what type of government do we believe our social contract should be based on? And if we do believe that it's a representative democracy, who gets a seat at the table? Who is us? Is the question that I like to phrase, because to some degree, the history of the country has been one of getting that table expanded, putting more leaves in the table, so to speak. And then the third most important issue in my mind is the fundamental model of meritocracy that's so much under threat today. And it goes to the question of how do we recognize achievement in our society and distribute rewards. And there's been a lot written in the last 15 years about how the meritocratic model is dying, and a lot of people advocating to abandon it. And I believe that's really troublesome. So in a nutshell, I'm hopeful that you'll read the book in the sense that the solution to all these comes down to 2 forms of change. And they break out into what I call mindset changes and structural changes. Both are required. And what I spend and the book, by the way, lays them out in detail, which I'm not going to give you the answers tonight, but it's things like a lot of the things that you guys care about, like term limits and voting reform and electoral college reform and changing the way. It's a lot of stuff that, as a hint, was in this book called The Common Purpose, if you're familiar with it. What are the structural changes we need? But to get to the structural changes, we need this mindset change. So I work on those two things today. The good news is the following. This is a report from the Hidden Tribes. It was done a couple of years ago now. But what it shows is that there are a lot of people in America that make up the exhausted majority. In fact, that's who I was trying to reach in my private sector world. Those private sector leaders who fundamentally embrace reason but what happens is the voice of the exhausted majority is crowded out by the extremes. And it's increasingly that way because of the nature of the structure of our political systems and the way we have framed and structured our media. And those have to change. So, there's ways that this is already happening. There's a network, a bridging network, if you will, across many different parts of society that recognizes that the current conversation is counterproductive, and how do we change it? All right, so I mentioned the book. Let's see why is this not working? Okay, these are a few hints I wanted to provide. So on the structural side, one of the major things I talk about in the third part of the book is that no democracy can work without civic education, which we've abandoned. That to some degree, STEM education, science, technology, engineering, math, have crowded out the need for civic education. One of the reasons why, as a historian, the 1792 French Constitution, before the Reign of Terror, was so important, is because it recognized that for a representative democracy, a certain level of education was the state's responsibility and had to be provided to sustain. And Condorcet, who was the author of that constitution, and again, this is before the Reign of Terror, really created a whole structure that's quite important and really the nuts and bolts of what a democratic republic requires. The second key hint is that equality of outcomes, I think, is counter to the American credo, and that's what many in the social commentary about our meritocracy talk about. But the equality of opportunity is fundamental to it. And for those of you who've read John Rawls or understand what I'm talking about when I refer to equality of opportunity, I'm talking about it on many different levels, which is too much to go into now, but in the book. The third major area is that free speech is sacred, but accurate information is a public good. And what do I mean by this? In my most recent business job, I was responsible for about $6 million of advertising a week in a budget. Every piece of advertising that my teams put out had to be reviewed for claims, medical claims from the FDA, and marketing claims from the FTC. Whereas in political advertising, you can say whatever you want and nobody cares a hoot if it has any sense of truth to it at all. So we're in some place where we're so enamored with free speech that to what degree are we inhibiting the flow of information, which from an economic model sense is a public good. Anyway, the reason why term limits to me, which I used to be against, is so important is because it's very clear that in federal office, at least, much more money and time is going into getting reelected than in solving problems. And that's the fundamental problem. And the mindset changes have to do with how we talk to each other and listen to each other, and how we can't engage through Twitter. It's not going to work. And I used to say this to my marketing teams all the time, about the importance of accurate data and facts. In God we trust, but everyone else has to bring the data. And that notion, having conversations devoid of what we agree as part of the constitution of knowledge, if you read Jonathan Rauch, that's a very dangerous thing that we seem to do very willingly today. So again, I know I'm probably over time, but what I hope you guys do is plug into this ecosystem, which I'm really plugging into now, and that we really engage the private sector leaders, particularly, because public sector leaders recognize the nature of the problem. I was just testifying for the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence Thursday. They have a group on polarization, and the recognition amongst the committee members of how bad this problem is huge. And so I think, but it's the private sector that also needs to get engaged. And I hope you reach out to me. I'd love to help if I can in any way. Please, if you can, pick up the book. It's here. I'm happy to sign them. It's a nonprofit endeavor. Again, every dollar that I get from the book goes into speaking engagements that support this kind of stuff. So please do so. And please reach out to me if you think I could help speak to your organizations or make a difference? And I'm sorry that I went over a little bit.
7 minutes.
I went over 7 minutes?
7 minutes.
I'm sorry. I only put.
I worked in television. I get to count these things, but there's some interesting things that I want to come back to later.
Okay.
That's an interesting quote that you talked about. It reminds me of what we often said in journalism. If your mother says she loves you, check it out. Right? It's got to be about the facts. And I want to come back to the facts in a minute, but I really would be very interested in hearing how this foundation that you've taken us all the way back to links to Bill's work. So Bill goes back to 1960 and what happened in 1960 and start there and bring us forward.
Oh, well, I've been a professor for a long time, as well as a journalist and television broadcaster. And as a professor, this is a few years ago here at George Mason University, a student once asked me, is this the most divided we've ever been as a country? You know, I said, we did once have a civil war. And it's estimated that 750,000 Americans died in the Civil War, not in battle, but most of them from starvation or disease. But I added, this is probably the most divided we've been in this country since the Civil War. In fact, the polls show that half of all Americans believe we're going to have a new civil war in the next few years. It won't be a sectional civil war. Can you imagine New York and California invading Texas and Florida? I mean, it's absurd. And it wouldn't be an economic class war because a lot of working class voters, particularly white working class voters today, are conservative Republicans. So it wouldn't be like it used to be. What it is a cultural division. And the origins date back to the 1960s, when the Democrats embraced the civil rights movement and set off a massive voter realignment. I grew up with this realignment. I witnessed it. It was my time. Let me share with you my favorite statistic from American political history. I was famous on CNN for reporting obscure statistics. So let me give you one. In the 1968 election, Mississippi was Richard Nixon's worst state. He got 14% of the vote in Mississippi. George Wallace got 63% of the vote. Remember those numbers, 14 for Nixon, 63 for Wallace. 4 years later, in 1972, Mississippi was Richard Nixon's best state. He got 78% of the vote, approximately the sum of the Nixon and Wallace votes. You see what happened? Nixon used his Southern strategy, appealing to white racial backlash voters, to fold the Wallace vote into the Republican vote, where it has been ever since. And it's not just Southern whites. A lot of Northern urban ethnic whites, people I used to call on television Archie Bunker voters. I can't say that in class anymore because the students say, Archie who? But they were also folded into the Republican Party. And the result has been to invert the class division in American politics. In the 1930s, that's before my time, I'm pleased to tell you. In the 1930s, class differences were at the heart of politics. It was the culmination of an era of epic labor strike, sit-down strikes, lockdowns, lockouts, union busting. The US had the most violent labor movement in any industrial country in the world. Not the most radical, but the most violent. Mm-hmm. In those days, the question you would ask to find out a voter's politics would have been, do you sympathize more with business or with labor? That was in the 1930s. Beginning in the 1960s, class conflict has given way to cultural conflict. Today, the questions that work best to define a voter's politics, aside from race, of course, would be one, how often do you go to church? Regularly or only occasionally or rarely? And do you happen to have a college degree? Education and religiosity define a voter's culture, liberal or conservative. It has long been the case that the wealthier you are, the more likely you are to vote Republican. That's still true today, though not as much as it used to be. In the 2020 election, support for Donald Trump did rise from 44% among voters with incomes, family incomes below $50,000 to 54% among those whose family incomes was above 50,000. There's something new going on. I call it the diploma divide. Today, the better educated you are, the more likely you are to vote Democratic. White voters with a college degree voted 51% for Joe Biden in 2020. Non-college educated white voters voted 67% for Donald Trump. There's a huge difference. Now, my students will then listen carefully, and someone will raise his hand or her hand and say, what happens to voters who are both wealthy and well-educated? They are what sociologists call, I'm going to use a bit of jargon here, cross-pressured. Their conservative interests, if they're wealthy, pull them to vote Republican. Their liberal values, since they're well-educated, pull them to vote Democratic. They're pulled in different directions. And that is why under Donald Trump, Republicans have been losing so many wealthy white suburban voters, particularly here in Northern Virginia, to Democrats. Trump offends their values. To a lot of college-educated Republican voters, Donald Trump is an embarrassment. The hazard for Democrats in this division is a very simple one. And it remains a very serious problem for Democrats. The problem is what I call condescension. They look with condescension on Trump voters and less well-educated voters. Yeah. Where do you find this? If you've ever been to Martha's Vineyard, you will find a lot of it up there. What is an example of condescension? Barack Obama saying during the 2008 campaign, I can't get votes from people who cling to guns and religion. It was Hillary Clinton in 2012 saying also at what she thought was a private fundraiser, there are no such things. Everything is public. She said, my opponent, Donald Trump, is supported by a basket of deplorables. And his supporters started wearing buttons that said, I'm proud to be a deplorable. That's condescension. And it's the fatal flaw of liberals in this country. In the New York Times poll of Republican primary voters looking towards 2024, Trump's support drops from 58% among non-college educated Republicans, this is for the next nomination, to 28% among Republicans with a college degree. The split is painfully evident in this year's Republican primaries between the establishment Republicans and what Biden calls the MAGA insurgents, the Make America Great Again insurgents, very much an educational split. Consider this. In the 2020 election, Joe Biden carried every one of the 10 best educated states in the United States. One of those states happens to be Virginia, number 6 or 7, depending on how it's counted. And it's the only Southern state that voted for Biden. And I believe it also voted for Hillary in 2016. Trump carried 8 of the 10 least well-educated states. There were 2 exceptions, New Mexico and Nevada, both of which have large Latino populations. That's a, by and large, not very well-educated community. The least educated state is, surprise, not Mississippi. The least educated state in the country with the fewest college degrees is West Virginia. It's a state that's 94% white, and it voted 69% for Donald Trump. Religion has also become a crucial source of division. Education and religion, that's new for polarization. Religion has become a source of division. It always was, but the old division over religion was mostly between Protestants and Catholics, with Protestants more Republican, Catholics more Democratic. That's not the case anymore. Now it's not what faith you adhere to, but how religious you are. Regular churchgoers vote much more Republican than non-churchgoers, certainly among whites, not so true among blacks. Trump's strongest support comes from white evangelicals. Now, one thing you may or may not know, I'm sure you know this, the United States is an exceptional country because it is unusually religious. More Americans believe in God, angels, heaven, hell, Satans, do not believe in evolution. And more Americans, some 40%, say they go to church every week. The ministers don't see them, but they claim they go to church every week. This is, I've seen scatter plots done by social scientists. The wealthier the country, the less religious it is, until you get to the United States, which is by far the wealthiest country and by far the most religious country. That's quite exceptional in the United States. And the religious division has become much more serious politically, and it's a division not between religions, but over religiosity. How often do you go to church? Because the core of the Republican vote today is fundamentalist Protestants, observant Catholics, and even Orthodox Jews. They're the ones who vote regularly Republican. I once asked a religious right activist of my acquaintance how a man like Donald Trump, who has very few evident religious convictions, is so popular with religious voters. The answer was simple. He said, because he delivers. So I asked, what has he delivered? His response was, he's delivered what we have been praying for 50 years, the Supreme Court of the United States. That's enough. Differences based on religion and race and education are not simply divisions of interest like business versus labor in the 1930s. They're differences of values and identity. Differences of interest can be negotiated and they can be compromised. Differences of values and identity cannot. And I believe that's the core of our polarization in this country today. Differences that cannot be negotiated and compromised, but differences that are fundamental, principally differences of identity, like those between religious and non-religious Americans. That, I believe, is the core of our polarization. I'm going to stop it with that.
Wow, that's an interesting place to stop, because you've given us so much to think about, not only when it comes to our politics, but whether or not we're looking at the polarization in this country correctly, whether we're looking at the right metrics, as we like to say now, right? Whether we're looking at the right issues when it comes to why we're so polarized. I saw a lot of head shaking at the other end of the table, Neil, and so I'm really interested to hear what you have to say, because your role in this is moving forward from that, right? Recognizing it, defining it, understanding where it came from. We started here, and then sort of defining what it's like, and then how do we begin to move forward with those understandings?
There's really nothing like being the third person on a panel, both because it's later in the evening. At least I'm not before like the food, and because one often wants to rewrite what you thought you would talk about in light of what you've heard. But I do want to thank both of you for that context. I'm Neelan Parker, and I'm not the director of the Bridging Divides Initiative. I was one of the founders, but Shannon Hiller, and I feel honor bound to say that because we have a Bridging Divide person in the room at present. I'm the executive director for Common Ground USA at Search for Common Ground. And Search is the world's oldest and largest non-governmental peace-building organization, fully dedicated peace-building organization. And over the last 40 years, it's worked in countries around the world in violent conflict and suffering from extreme polarization. And now we work in the United States. So I'd like to briefly put the United States in the global context, and then I'd like to use some of the tools that we use to look at conflict generally applied back to the United States, and then move into now, what does that mean? What do we do? The definitions and the data make this slide very controversial, and my husband gave me a very hard time about putting it in there. But I think it is helpful. It's the last 400 years, so Seth, I hope you'll appreciate it. Which tells the story of, on the x-axis we have time, and on the y-axis we have years in which there were great powers fighting. And on the one hand, the big thing you see is over these 500 years there is a decline, and that's a sort of positive story. But you also see that it's not a straight line down, that there are periods where it's lower and periods where it's higher. You also see that this data stops at 2015, but it's a great story if this were the whole story until 2015. But it's not. And I think the optimism that this slide puts out there should be tempered for a couple of different reasons. One is that the data does end in 2015. And we'll talk a little bit about what happens after that. But also, there are losers. It is the fact that while there is this decline, there are losers in it. You see that in the United States, in the wings of both political parties. People who for whom this system is not delivering. Also, it's the case that conflict itself has evolved, and that a lot of the conflict, the violent conflict that we see, is with non-state actors, terrorism and militias. And the UN actually reports that violence is on the rise. And finally, there are other things that I think we care about, like increases in authoritarianism and decreases in freedom that are playing out. And again, this is globally in ways that are really important. But this period from sort of 1946 to present, you started in the civil rights movement, but that also was living in this context of World War I, World War II, backlash against that. We're going to create the modern multilateral system. And there are huge increases that correlate with this period in education and health and a whole series of other positive things that were referenced. So let's take this to the US context. By many measures, the United States is doing quite well. It is militarily hegemonic, economically a powerhouse, politically very important. And the overwhelming majority of Americans reject violence as a means by which to solve our differences. By the Sustainable Development Report, the United States rolls in at 41st, which on the one hand, because the United States likes to see itself as the leader of the free world, is nothing to write home about. But on the other hand, not bad. You know, there are most countries that are not as high as the United States. Nonetheless, the Fragile States Index records the United States as the most worsened, and I do wish there were another way to say that, the most worsened country in 2021, and 2022 continued that trend. So why? When Search is looking at to try to understand the sort of health of a society, or trying to understand the potential and the nature of violence, it looks at the societal vital signs for the peace impact framework, and we look at 5 different things, and you can relatively quickly click through these. The physical violence, agency. I think physical violence is pretty straightforward, but agency is sort of a person's sense that they are able to be in charge of their own lives, that there is potential and opportunity, that they can have control over themselves and their community. Polarization, how do we feel about each other? How do communities feel about each other? Do we have a sense that the other is in fact not just different, not even necessarily just wrong, but maybe evil? And you've seen as we've progressed culturally down that direction. Institutional legitimacy, and here I think about there are any number of institutions, but I have been thinking mostly about those institutions that kind of undergird the functioning democracy. So the government, elections, the security sector, the police, media. And finally, sustainable resourcing. And this is the interaction between markets and conflict. So on the one hand, it can be people who succeed financially from in some countries, increased gun sales, or this sort of like war economy. But it can also be on the flip side of that. How are your markets set up to increase the likelihood of decreasing divisions? Mm. So with more time, I would go into each of these, but I'm just going to highlight a few of them as they apply to the United States. Physical violence, hate crimes in the United States over 2 years posted double-digit increases. This corresponded with violent crime increasing, a 29% increase in 2020 in homicides, and a continued increase in all of these since then. Institutional legitimacy. Trust in government is low. I think we know that. Only 2 in 10 Americans say that they trust the government to do what is right most of the time in a Pew survey. Trust in elections. Only 20% of the public says that they are very confident in our country's elections. only 20%. And that's according to a 2022 poll. Trust in the security sector. We have had a complicated relationship with the police in this country for a long time, but there was a significant decrease in the trust preceding and then after 2020 and the murder of George Floyd. And then finally, polarization. Democrats and Republicans believe that violence could be justified to advance their political party goals, and a significant percentage of Democrats and Republicans see the other as a serious threat to the country and its people. And there are any number of other statistics that we could show that also demonstrate that kind of polarization. So what do we do? So search works globally, not just to kind of hold back the bad things from happening, but to try to build enduring change. And that is a very creative process. It's a very tailored process. And it's designed by those most intimately affected by it. But if you have to boil the myriad of different programs down to 3 components, it would look like this. It begins with affording a kind of humanization and dignity to the broadest possible groups, and a recognition of their ability to both design and be involved in programs and the process of solving their problems and also building a future in which they can see themselves. So you build trust. And in this period, you don't actually sort of like pull people away and say, now we are going to build this utopic trust over here. You go to where people already are. So a lot of this work happens wherever there is sort of already energy in sports, media, potentially back channel negotiations. From there, you build collaboration, because it's actually not enough to talk. You need to see success from what you're doing. And the successes, you sort of work together. You know, often you'll see something like a market has burned down in a city and nobody can get their goods sold. So if you build that market, rebuild that market together with the sides that have been in conflict with each other, there is communal benefit from that collaboration. And you can start in small ways and then add that up, and it can become self-sustaining. But ultimately, for this sort of broader, enduring change, for this big kind of breakthrough, you have to harness bigger energy. And this looks like in making changes with institutions or social norms or markets. So we do a lot of work influencing media on social norms. Institutions would look like democratic reforms, many of which have been on the table for some time. And finally, markets, and that looks like having the private sector engage in ways that are likely to decrease, likely to increase collaboration, et cetera. So what does this look like in the United States? I can be more specific at a later time, but the first thing here, which is a little bit distinct, we focus on this kind of like enduring change, but the United States, while I'm not making any claims about whether or not we are headed into a civil war, we can have that question later, it has some very hallmark characteristics of a conflict, of a kind of sort of trying to keep conflict from happening, that kind of a space. So the first thing that we want to do is interrupt violence. And we can do this, we do this all the time, but there are many ways that we don't know. Violence is a funny thing. It's a very unpredictable thing in many ways, but there are times where we can see patterns. So we know that there's increased polarization for a whole host of different reasons leading up to an election, and we can plan against that. And we can create programs that prevent that violence and that de-escalate around that violence. You can also, there was a conversation with some students from Germany, exchange students here, and I think quite a bit about Germany, because in the sort of story of Germany, one day the Berlin Wall fell. And it was amazing that day. But the truth is that actually huge amounts of work had been happening prior to that moment. And you can call them like mini crises or mini turning points. These are scary moments where everyone sort of steps back from their tribal places and says, maybe we want to do something differently. So they're also opportunities. How do you take those moments and turn them away from being crises there, or even the steady state of where you are, and harness that to something bigger? Reestablishing trust in institutions. So investing in making the government deliver on COVID, but also investing in security sector reform, meaningful security sector reform, and in the transparency and function of elections. Finally, fostering trust and collaboration. This is that cultural change that we're looking that we're talking about, and I'm going to hand to Debbie Lynn, among many others, to talk about the work that's already being done in this country around that. And then finally, creating mechanisms for private sector engagement. So this looks like, for example, colleges and universities investing in common ground orientation, or tech investing in algorithms to counter mis and disinformation, or to build a more positive online communication. I was going to finish with what individuals can do, but in light of the time, why don't we pause and then we can move into discussion.
I'm very interested in knowing what individuals can do. And I would imagine that a lot of us are, because this is the place you talked about, engaging the private sector, but this is the place where we engage ourselves. This is that sense of agency that you talked about, right? Having some control over the polarization that many people feel is ripping apart the world in which we live. So we are at time for our online audience. And I think that we have been able to, through the comments that you shared, going all the way back to the foundation of our world, through some of the most turbulent political times that we've seen, and now looking forward to what we need to do, it is my hope that we've been able to share with them some good sense of where we are, why we are where we are, and how we can begin to look forward. And so with that, I'm going to wrap that portion of our program for our online audience. However, for those of you in the room, we have a lot to unpack tonight. We have a lot to talk about. So for those of you who joined us online, we thank you, and we hope that you will follow the Eisenhower Institute right where you are watching tonight, and continue to watch for other impactful programs like this as we really start to look much more intentionally at where we are in our world right now and what we can do about that.